In this video, I'm going to make a copy of the Facebook login page with HTML and CSS. It's another good beginner project, and there's a few things to consider here with the layout. Additionally, there is some responsiveness, so as the page gets smaller, it switches from a side-by-side layout to a vertically stacked one with everything on top. So I'm going to be using Flexbox throughout this. Now, just to begin, I've got my two files here, so my index and my style sheet. There's no assets to go with this, so it's quite a simple folder structure. And I'm using Sublime Text, so within my HTML document, I can just type out HTML, hit tab, and it creates this skeleton structure for me already. So let's switch over to my working document here, and I'll start off by just giving it a title, and then I'm going to start working on the body section here. So the body is going to be split up into two main sections. I will have this section up here. This is going to be my main wrapper, and then the footer. The main wrapper itself is then going to be split into this left-hand side with the branding and right-hand side with the form. So let's just begin creating these sections. I'll create a section, give it the class of main wrapper. So that's that top section. And just close out this tag. And then within this section, I then need to divide it further into two more divs. So the first div is going to be branding. That's the stuff on the left-hand side that was the Facebook logo and this text here. And then the other div is going to be on the right-hand side. So let's close that div out and let's create this other div. So this is going to be given the class of, actually no, this doesn't really need a class. The only reason it's a div is just so that I can separate it from the branding area. So let's close that tag out. So that's my two divs. If I save this, nothing happens just yet, but I can now start populating this first one. So this first one is the branding div. And within it, I want to add in a header one and give it a class of logo. And in here, it's just going to say Facebook. So this is going to be the Facebook logo. I could have used an image for it, but I'm just going to style the text. So there we go. And it just comes up pretty plain to start with. And we want another one underneath. And I'm going to give this a H2. This is going to be the slogan. And the slogan is Facebook, whoops, I missed an E there. Facebook helps you connect and share with the people in your life. Close that out. And there we go. So that's pretty much it. In terms of HTML, that's the left-hand side done. Now let's set up the right-hand side, and then I will come back and style it all. So I'm not going to do it in bits just yet. I'll set up all the form stuff and style it all in one go. So that's this div complete. Now we can work on the div that's on the right-hand side. And within it, again, it's going to be further split up into additional divs. So this bit here essentially is just everything to the right of my Facebook branding. But within it, of course, there's this little panel. And then within that, then there's further dividers. So first of all, let's create that panel. We'll add another div, give it a class of panel so that I can style it with that sort of white background and box shadow and everything on it. So it actually sticks out from the page. Close that one out. And within it, the main thing that's going to be there is this form. So I'm going to wrap it in a form tag. And within the form tag are going to be my inputs. So these first two are going to be just input boxes. And then this one's going to be my button. So I can say input, and I'll break this out over a few lines just so it all fits in. And in fact, I'm also going to hide that panel on the left. So my input is, what type is it? Well, it's a text input. The name is username. So that's what the first input is going to be, that box. So let's just save this first of all and see what's happening here. So there we go. This input has appeared. That's this first box up here. But notice it also has some text in it by default. It says enter email address, or just email address or phone number. So I can add that in here as an additional variable or argument. And its placeholder is equal to email address or phone number. Save that, and now you can see it's already pre-populated. And I'm also going to add a required tag at the end. So this essentially means that you won't be able to submit it. So I can't click on login without putting something in first of all. So that's the first input box. And then underneath that, I have another one which says password. So I'm just going to copy that down and just change a couple of things on it. So the first thing to change is the type is no longer text. So this first one was a text input, but the second one is actually a password. So we change that to password. The name is also password. and the placeholder is also password. So we'll get rid of that. And this one is also a required field. So if I save that now, you can see my password has appeared, but as I type in here, it automatically converts it into these little dots. So it knows that this is a password field and it hides them for me. And then the last input is going to be that button. So I'm not creating it as a button or a link. It is actually going to be an input. So let's paste this down again. Now this input type is going to be button. And it doesn't have to have a name. So we can get rid of that. It doesn't have a place. In fact, I can get rid of all of these because none of that applies to a button. So save that. Now this tiny little button has appeared, but there's nothing in it. So what I need to do is underneath add a value to it. And the value is going to be login. So whatever the value is what's going to display. Save that, and there you go. I've got this login button. To be able to style it though, I need to give it a class. So let's give it a class of login button. Okay, so that's the first part set up. That's all this here. So then I need to have this forgotten password link underneath it. So let's add that in. I'll put that below the form because the form is essentially finished. These inputs are done. Now I'm just putting in links, so they don't need to go in the form. So I'll add a link. I'll give it a class so I can style it. So this is going to be forgot. And link doesn't go anywhere, so it's just going to be a dummy link. And it says forgotten password. So close that tag. Oh, it's not a div. Close that tag, and there we go. We've got a link coming up as well. And then underneath the link, there's this dividing line. So let's just add that in as well. And I'm just going to use a horizontal line for this. So the tag is HR. Save that, and there we go. It does span the entire page, but that's just because it takes up the entire available space for it. So when I come to style it, I'm only going to give it this width of the panel, so it's not going to go across the whole page. So that's done. Next thing is this button underneath. So that again is just going to be a link. So I can copy down what I used for forgotten password. It's just I'm going to style it differently. So that for that I give it a different class of register button. The link again doesn't go anywhere, and then the contents of the text are going to be create new account. Save that, and there we got another link. Okay, so that's the panel done, but that's not the entire right hand side. So there is also this little section here. There's a link and a little bit of text. So let's add that in as well. However, remember that all of this stuff is within the panel div. That text is outside the panel. So I need to make sure that I get it in the right section. So this is my panel div, and then this is the overall div. So outside here, I can now create another little div, give it the class of bottom link, not button, bottom link. And within here, I can add my actual link. So I'll say A, give it a class of page for creating a new page. And the link doesn't go anywhere. And then the text is create a page. So we close the A tag, and then I open a P tag, a paragraph tag right next to it to say for a celebrity, brand, or business. And then just finally close out that last div. And there we go, that section is done. So what I've done here is I've created a link, and then in line with it, I've created a paragraph. Or I'm going to have to style it so that it all comes up in line. So if I save this just now, it actually comes up underneath. So the paragraph is displayed on its own line underneath my create a page link, but I actually want them to be in a line here. So now that the HTML markup for, well, essentially the entire body section, this main wrapper is done, before I get into the footer, I'm going to start styling it. So for that, I need to make sure that I call through my style sheet. So there's nothing in it just yet, but I also need to make sure that it comes through into my HTML document. So right in this head section, above where I've got my title, I'm going to type link, hit tab, and it pre-populates. So it's a style sheet, and then the location is going to be style.css, simply because that is the name of this document, and they are both in the same folder as each other. So that's going to access everything that I change in here. So if I say body and background color red, there we go, the whole thing has gone red. So now I can start getting to work on the CSS of this. So let's get rid of this. Now, first of all, I like to reset some default values when working with CSS documents. So right at the beginning, I'm going to go into, I'm going to use this star or this asterisk here, and this is going to affect all of the elements in the HTML document. And so what I'm going to say is I want some values to be applied to everything. So if I say margin is 0, notice when I save what happens to all of these. Suddenly everything is bunched up against all the elements next to each other. So there previously was a margin by default around all these elements, and they were spaced out, so each one of them has a different margin on its own. But as I set them all to 0, they're all just bunched up next to each other. So that's fine, that's what I wanted. I'll be able to adjust them manually as I go. I reset the padding to 0, and then I set the box sizing to border box. There we go. So that is some initial styling done, and now I can actually get to work on the rest of it. So first of all, I'm going to start off with the body. I like to just work through this sort of in the same order as what I've got with my HTML document. It makes it easier to then go back and forth and find things within the CSS. So essentially, first of all, I'll start with the body and then just work my way down through them. So first, I want the body to span the entire height of the page. If I inspect this just now, the body just takes up, well, it's just as big as all the elements combined. So as I add more of them, it's going to fill out down the way, but it's only going to be limited by the amount of content. What I actually want is for the body to take up the entirety of the page. So for that, I just need to set a height, and I'm going to use this VH value. So it's just the vertical height. Essentially, it just divides the entire screen into individual, well, if you like, little segments, and it divides them into 100. So it's almost like a percentage, and I'm essentially saying that no matter how big the screen is, the body is always going to take up the full height of it. So with that, I just want to make sure that I don't ever end up with a scroll bar on the right hand side, because the Facebook page doesn't have one. There's not really enough content and there's nothing below it to scroll to. So I'm going to set overflow to hidden, and then let's change the background color. So I'll say background color, and here I'm going to go, so the background I'm going to use is F0, F2, F5. It's very subtle, but if I save this, there you go, you notice it goes slightly grayer. But what I actually want to do, I'm going to have different colors that I'm going to be using throughout this page, and some of them are going to be reused. So this blue, for example, is used in a couple of places, or 3 actually. So rather than individually declaring them over and over, I'm going to have a section where I define some variables. So then rather than typing out the color each time, I can just call that variable name. And I'm going to do that within the root of the document. So here I can define a few variables. For example, this background color I can take out of here and put in here as a variable. Now to define a variable, you just add 2 hyphens and then the name of your variable. So mine is just BG for background. And then what is the variable? Well, it's just that color. So now instead of typing this, I can put my variable in here. I can type VAR for variable, and within the brackets, just call it out exactly as it is named here. So if I comment this out for a second, it will reset the color back to default, back to white, uncomment, and there we go. So it still works exactly the same, but now at the background, well, all of my colors over time, or most of my colors, not all of them, will be contained within here. So if I want to change the colors, I'll be able to quickly see them, and they're all going to be in one place up in this section. So it's going to grow as I develop this document. And the last thing I want to style in the body is the font. I'll say font family, and I'm going to set it to Helvetica and comma sans serif. So if I save this now, you notice all the font changes, and actually is a lot more similar. I don't think they used Helvetica here, but it's quite similar. So as we style it further, it's going to start to resemble it a lot more. So the next thing that I want to work on is this main wrapper here. So this section that contains the branding and the login bit, I want to start styling this. But what I'm actually going to do is work from the smaller screen up the way. So if I compress this down, there we go. So it's about this size. I'm going to build up the page that way, and then I'm going to add media queries that allow it to change as the screen gets bigger. So I'm going to go the other way around, kind of mobile first. So to do this, I need to access, or I need to target the container for this. And that container, if we go back to this HTML section, it's section class of main wrapper. So to target that, I start off with a full stop and then main wrapper. Now that's because it's a class. If that was an ID, I would start off with a pound sign. So as it's a class, we say full stop, main wrapper, and that targets that class. A couple of things I want to do here. So first of all, you can see there's a fixed width here. So as this gets bigger or smaller, it doesn't actually change. So we'll go with a fixed width, and I'll give it a width of 400 pixels. There we go, it's quite a bit smaller. And then I'll give it a height of 680 pixels. Now you can't actually see anything changed just yet, but if I inspect it, you can see now it takes up all of this additional space, whereas before it would only go as well just to the bottom of the content of it. That's fine, but now it's still sitting on the left hand side and I need it to be in the middle. And for that, I'm just going to set my margins to auto. As I save that, it now jumps to the middle. What this essentially does is it tells the browser to look at how much space was available on the right hand side, like this, and then just divide it in two. Put one half on the left and one half on the right. So it's just automatic margin. It works out what's available and it puts it equally on both sides. Now that that's centered, I can move it down a little bit. So right now it's way at the top of the screen. So for that, I will target the specific margin that I want, which is the top. So margin top is going to be 40 pixels, and that moves everything down a little bit. And that's pretty much it for now. I'm going to come back to this class and work on it a little bit more when I add in the responsiveness, but for now, that's pretty much all I need. It's stacking everything up on top of each other. So now I can start styling the individual sections. So this bit up here was within a div called branding. If I go back to the HTML document, you see here the text itself is buried within a div. So let's target that div first of all. So we will say dot branding because that is the class name of it. And I want to align the text in the center. So we just say text align center. And to save that, it automatically aligns all of the contents within it. So I didn't have to target these individually. I just targeted the div and told it to align all of the text that's within it centrally. So that's fine. Now let's start working on the logo. Well, the first thing for the logo is to change the text color to this blue for Facebook. So we can say color, and I can just put in the color code in here. But remember, I want to keep all the colors together at the top as variables. So I come back up and I declare a new one. So this new one is going to be blue, and the code for that is going to be 1877F2. So now I can, instead of just typing it out, I can come down here and say var for variable, and it's just going to be the blue variable. Save that, and there we go. It's changed to this blue color. So that's fine. Now I need to make it quite a bit bigger. So we'll change the font size. Font size becomes 3.7 rem. So it's 3.7 times as big as the root font size. And there we go. That's quite a lot bigger. It's just about the right size. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but close enough. It's also not the same font because they used an image there. Next thing I want to do is actually bring the letters closer together. You can see here, they're bunched up a little bit closer than what I've got. And that can be controlled with letter spacing. So I can set letter spacing to say 5 pixels, and that spaces them further apart. So it puts pixels between them, and it gives us a nice effect of moving everything apart from each other. So let's put it to 0 pixels. It just goes back to how it was. Well, how do I move them together? Well, I can just go into the negative direction. So by saying negative 3 pixels, it actually bunches the letters closer together. That's too close. Let's stick with 3. So that's looking a lot more similar to what I had going on there. So that's the logo done. Now let's move on to this bit here, the slogan. So we target that class again, slogan. And first of all, let's up the font size. So we'll go with 1.5 times rem. Oh, that didn't change. What have I done? Go back to the document, slogan. Yeah, that's correct. Oh, maybe that is the... Oh, okay, So I guess a H2 is by default 1.5. So what if I make this bigger? Yeah, okay. All right, well, that is the default size already. So I don't actually need to say this, but I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to fix that font size. But then also, you notice on the actual page, it's a much lighter font. It's not quite as bold. So to do that, I can change the font weight. I can specify a number, but I'm just going to say lighter, and it just moves down a lightness level, if you like. It's less bold than it was before. I also want to move it away from the logo. So there's a bit of space here, and I need to add that in. So I'm just going to say margin of 20 pixels, top and bottom, and 0 left and right. There we go, and it spaces everything out away from it. Okay, so that's actually the branding pretty much done. There's not much else I want to do to it. So now I can move on to this section here, this panel area. Now you can see there's quite a lot of work to do to it before it looks anything like the real thing. So first of all, let's start working on the panel class. So like I said, I like to work through it from top to bottom. So the first class we come to is the panel class. Let's begin styling that one. Say panel. and I need to give it a background color so it actually stands out because it's got a background color of white. But again, I'm going to define a variable. So let's go up here and we'll say white, and the variable for that is FFF. So now I can just put in here var dash dash FF, oh, not the color, white. And there we go. You can see it, it's not looking too good at the moment, but you can see it. So the panel is now colored in white. So let's give this a fixed width as well. Go width of 400 pixels. Okay, so for the time being, nothing changes because it's in the same container as before, but when the layout changes later on, the fixed width is going to be important. Then let's add a little bit of padding. So at the moment you can see everything's bunched up right up against the panel. There's no space around it. So if I add in padding of say 15 pixels all around, it just pushes everything in the way. So the box stays the same size as it was, but it creates this unusable space and everything else has to stay within it. And also let's add a little bit more margin. So we'll go 20 pixels top and bottom and 0 left and right. So that spaces it out for me. And round the corners, so border radius of 6 pixels. There we go, it's a little bit better. And now the main thing that makes this panel look good and actually pop from the page is this box shadow. It gives it a 3D effect. So let's add that in. I'll say box shadow, and you can play around with these numbers to see what everything does and how you can essentially change the effect quite drastically by just tweaking some of them. So what I need now is the color. So the box shadow I'm going to use, well, it's kind of a grayish color, so I'll go 150, 150, 150, but notice there's an A at the end for alpha. So this is just how transparent it is. If I just set it to 1, there's my box shadow, and it's not transparent, it's solid. So if I set this to a more preferred value like 0.2, you can see it's much lighter. It's essentially just a bit more transparent, but it looks a lot better and more similar to what's going on here. So just by adding this one line, it goes from a pretty dull white section to what actually looks like a little panel that's sticking up from the page. It gives it this 3D effect. And lastly, I want to align the text inside it. So say text align center. And there we go, just like I did here. I don't have to individually align things. I just say text align center, and all of the text, all of those contents are automatically aligned for me. Okay, so now let's move on to the inputs. So that's going to actually cover, if I just target my input tag, that's going to cover these two, but it's also going to cover the button. And that's not a bad thing, because if you notice, they're all pretty much the same. Okay, the button's got a different color and there's a hover effect, but the size and width, well, they're the same. So to avoid me having to repeat code here and to repeat my CSS, I can just target all of them. First of all, let's say width of 100%, because right now they're just taking up a fixed size, essentially. They're taking up the space that's available to them. Well, if we say width of 100%, now they're going to take up all of the space. So they're going to go as far as the panel allows them to, excluding the padding. And because there's no more room to stack side by side, they stack on top of each other. So that's good. I've got that sorted. Now, again, I need to add in some padding, because if you notice, all the text is right, it's just inside this here. It's all bunched up against the edges. So let's add in 15 pixels of padding. There we go. It makes the boxes quite a lot bigger as well automatically, because it needs to create that additional space. Now let's space them out. Say margin bottom only of 15 pixels. So that spaces them apart from each other. And then let's change the border color. So we'll say border, it's going to be 1 pixel, as it probably is just now, solid, and D2, D2, D2. There we go, that's a much lighter gray color. So now actually, you notice it's almost exactly the same. What I still need to do is round the corners. So I just need to add in a border radius. Say border radius of 6 pixels. There we go. Okay, and yeah, now it looks a lot more similar. In fact, it looks almost identical. There's a couple of little things left to style, such as, you notice the placeholder here is bigger than the text that I've got here. So to do that, we can target the placeholder specifically. So I'll go into the input, and then I just add 2 colons and say placeholder. So now I can style that. I can change the font size, and I'm going to set it to 1 rem. And there we go. It's gotten bigger and it matches what's going on there. So that's fine. Now what else happens? So when I click this, the outline goes this solid black color, which kind of jars against the rest of the page. When I click in here, it goes a much lighter blue color. So again, we can target that as well. I can say input focus. So that just means that it's highlighted, it's in focus. I just changed the outline. So the outline goes 1px solid. And here, now this is the benefit of having the variables at the top. I'm just going to call this variable. So I don't need to type out the color again. I just say var dash dash blue. Now if I click on it, it gives me the exact same light blue color around it instead of that solid black. So what else happens? It looks very similar. There is one more thing. So notice that when I click on this, the color of the placeholder actually changes as well. It's a small detail, but it's not too difficult to add. So let's do that just now. What I need to do here, again, is target the input tag, but there's going to be two different things here. So I'm going to be combining focus because it's when it's clicked on, but then when it's focused, I want to change only the placeholder. So I actually combine two things in here. And what I'm changing is the color. I set the color to C2, 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 which is just this lighter gray color. And now when I click on it, it does the same thing as the Facebook page. It just changes the color of the one I've selected to be a little bit lighter. So the inputs actually are pretty much done. But of course the button still doesn't quite look exactly as the real Facebook page. So the widths and the heights of it are set, but quite a lot of these, well, some of these other things haven't really applied to it. So now I need to specifically target that button. And that had its own class, which was login button. So now I can target it and I can style that button specifically. The first thing to do is change that background color from that gray to the blue that I need. So again, I'm going to be using my variables and we'll say blue. There we go. That's already changed. The text color though also needs to change. At the moment it's this black color. We need to change it to white. So again, variable white. Okay, that's looking better. Let's change the font size. So say 1.2 rems. They're going to improve it. It needs to get bigger. There we go. So I've got a bigger font now, but also the font weight. So I could just say bold, but I'm going to go with bolder. Just moves it up a little bit on the boldness scale. Let's add a little bit of padding to it. In fact, I don't know if it needs. Yeah, okay. So we'll set the padding and the button shrinks down a little bit just to match what I've got here. So actually, I think that's mostly it. There is a couple, so the button looks more or less the same, but there are a couple of little styling things that I want to add. So the first one is that when you move your mouse over it, it changes to this little hand, little cursor. That's not happening here by default because it's not really treating it in the same way as a link. So here it's being changed automatically, but here it doesn't. Well, I can add in that property here. So I can just target the login button again. It's login button, and it's just a hover state. So this means whenever the mouse hovers over it, there's a couple of little things that I want to change. Well, first of all, it was that cursor. So we changed the cursor to a pointer, and there we go. It's just a little hand, but also color changes. So the color goes from blue to a slightly darker blue. So let's say the background color now becomes, we'll go with a variable again, and this one is going to be dark blue. So I need to make sure that I go back up the top and I define a dark blue underneath the existing blue. And that's going to be dark-blue. And the color code for it is 1360C4. So let's save that now and go back to my page. And there we go. So it's actually going to this darker blue color. But, and it's another little styling thing, don't necessarily have to do it, but notice it seems to be a little smoother here. Whereas on my page, it happens instantly. It just flashes to the darker color. So what's happening here is a transition. It's not happening straight away. It's slowly transitioning between the colors as you put the mouse over and take it away again. So that can be done. It's almost like an animation. It can be done within the login button class itself. We can just add a transition to the background color so that it doesn't happen instantly. It takes a little bit of time. So to add transitions, well, first of all, I want to target a transition property. You don't necessarily have to do this, but it makes sense if you only have one or two things that are being transitioned so that the browser knows just to look for these particular things and it's a little bit less resource intensive. So the thing I want to look at is the background color. So the property is background color. And then I need to give it a transition duration. So how slowly or how quickly is it going to go? Well, this is going to be measured in, well, in my case, I'm going to measure in milliseconds. So I'll say 200 milliseconds. That's how how much time I want it to take from going from the lighter to the darker blue and backwards. So now you already notice it seems to be happening. So now it's not instant. And in fact, if I make this 2000 milliseconds, so it takes 2 whole seconds, oh, you can definitely notice the difference there. So it takes quite a while to get to the dark blue and then back again. But you can also mess around with how it gets to that. So right now it's just linear. It just goes gradually from light blue to dark blue and back again. But I can play around with the transition timing function, and there's a whole bunch of different options here. You can go into quite a lot of, a bit of a rabbit hole with them, but I'm just going to use some of the common ones. So if I go with ease in, ease out, it changes the speed at which the transition happens towards the start and the end. So maybe it isn't so obvious on a 2000 milliseconds, but if I switch it to 200, it probably still isn't all that obvious. But essentially it just smooths it down at the beginning and the end of the transition. So now it looks a little bit better, more closely to what's going on here. And with that, actually, that button is now complete as well. So we've gotten the first 3 elements done. Now I can move on to the link here. So the first thing you'll notice is with the link, I have constantly got an underline on all of my links, whereas here it only gets underlined when you hover over it. So that's going to apply to every single link, which means that I can just target all of the A's, all of the anchor tags. And the thing I want to do is get rid of the underline. So I can just say the text decoration is none. And there we go, they've all disappeared. But now it doesn't come back when I hover over it like it's supposed to, which means that I need to add another check here for when I hover over it. So just like what I did with the login button, and I need to add that back in here. So this is where I add the text decoration back in of underline. So now it's essentially done the reverse. So it's not underlined until I mouse over it. So that is fine, that's all set up. So that's the links done, which applies to all the links on the page, but now I want to target these individually. So this forgotten password right now is a little bit too big and it doesn't have enough space around it. So let's target forgot. So I had, well, I just had a class of forgot. And let's give it a font size. I'm not sure what it is by default, but it's definitely too big. So let's go 0.9 rem. There we go, that's a lot better. And the color as well, by default, it is a very similar blue, but not quite the same. So let's change the color of it as well. So color, var, and now you can start to see the benefit of having them variabled like this, because I've got this blue variable used in a few places. If I needed to change it, I only need to change it right at the top in the root of the document up here. I don't need to go through and look for each one. So you can see as the document gets bigger, that becomes a bit more important. So that's the forgotten password link done. Now I can move on to this horizontal line. Now remember when I started, this thing took up the entire page, but now because I've styled everything else around it, it's actually fitting in exactly where it needs to be. But first of all, it needs space around it, and it's also a little bit too heavy. So let's target that, which is just a HR element. I didn't need to give it a class because there is only one horizontal line here. First of all, let's space it apart. So 18 pixels top and bottom, nothing left and right, and there you go. But then I also want to make it quite a bit lighter. So I could change the color of it and mess around with that. But what I'm actually going to do is just change the opacity, which just sets the, effectively it's kind of like a transparency. So if I set this to 0.3, well, actually if I set it to 1, save it, nothing happens because I'm just saying it's as solid as it currently is. If I set this to 0, it disappears because it's fully transparent. So I'm going to set it to 0.3 and it's going to be pretty light, just like the real page here. And that's it, that's the HR tag done as well. Now the last thing within this panel anyway, is this create new account section. So at the moment I just have a link, but what's actually supposed to look like is this nice green button. It also has a hover effect and changes color, kind of similar to the login button. So there's quite a bit to do to get it to that stage. Well, first of all, let's do some initial styling on it before we get into the transitions and all that stuff. I'll just target the register button. And first of all, let's go with the background color. Now, of course, I need to define these colors up here again. So we'll go back up to the top and I will define green, which is going to be 42B72A. And while I'm here, I will define dark green as well, which is the one that is going to transition to. And this is going to be 369423. Okay, those are defined. So now I can start actually calling them up here. So my background color is going to be my var for variable, and it's green. Not green. Save that, and there we go. It looks terrible, but it's now green. So let's improve the look of it a little bit. First of all, change the text color. So we're going to use the variable for white here. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now I want to add some margin and padding. So first of all, let's go with padding, 15 pixels. Okay, that makes it bigger, but it's kind of weird. It's not really moved everything away from it. It's just taken up more space. Okay, so let's add a margin and see what happens. Margin of 10 pixels, top and bottom, 0 left and right. Oh, nothing's happening. So that is something that applies to links. In my case, because this register button is applied, where is it? Right there, it's applied to an anchor tag. Well, you can't actually give it margin and padding. It's not going to work. What I need to do is change how it's displayed. So we change the display to inline block. And now, there we go. So now it's got the padding and it's also being given this margin. So if I tweak this, set it to 20, it gives it a little bit more. Okay, and now just get rid of those horrible sharp corners. We'll go with border radius of 6 pixels again, just like all the others. In fact, I could have done a variable for this as well. I've used it in 3 different places and it would be easy to tweak just in one go, but I can't be bothered going back to it now. So we've got these little radius here, so that's looking a little bit better. It's actually looking quite similar to the real thing, but not quite there yet. Let's just change the font. So let's go font weight bolder. There we go, it's a little bit thicker now. It's looking better. So now I can start adding in some of the more, well, the styling stuff to it. So this hover effect, you notice in my case, it still gets underlined when I hover over it because it's a link. So it's been treated in the same way as all the rest. So let's create, well, let's target the hover state of it. So I'll go register button colon hover. So we've done this a few times now. It should be quite familiar at this point what's going to happen. First of all, we set the text decoration to none. That gets rid of that underline. So now that doesn't happen anymore, but also the color changes. So let's go background color, and I already defined this variable, which is dark green. Save that, and there we go. It instantly flicks to this darker green. But again, we want to add in the transition. We want to make it look a little bit nicer. So I can just copy the code from up here because it's going to be exactly the same. I want to transition the background color. I want to take 200 milliseconds and I want to use this ease in and out timing function. So let's save this and try again. And there we go. It's much better. It's just smoother. I guess I could go faster. We could go 100 milliseconds. It's maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that's probably more representative. Same for that one as well, actually. Let's go 100 milliseconds on both of these, just so it's a faster transition. Okay, so how's that looking now? I'd say so far it's very, very similar. I mean, I could play around with margins and padding and get things identical, but it's close enough, and that's kind of what we're going with here. I just want to go through the code and explain how to set this up. So the last thing to do before I actually get into the footer is this last link down the bottom. Now, because it's been outside of my panel div, I've not really styled it in any way. It's not been affected by all the other stuff I've done to it. So how is this structured, first of all? Well, it's got its own div of bottom link. So I'm going to style that. And then within it, there's an A and a paragraph. So I need to make sure I style all of those separately. So let's start with bottom link. So we target that one. And now we go back to how it looks on my page. So first of all, they're stacked next on top of each other and I want them in line. There's a couple of different ways to do it, but I pretty much always default to displaying using Flexbox. I probably don't need it for this. I could just change, so rather than them being block elements, I could just change that. But I just like using Flexbox. I find it really easy. So if I save this straight away, there you go. It's just stack them next to each other. It gets rid of that block and inline stuff, and it just takes things, puts them next to each other. I could also change that direction. I could say flex direction column, and now it stacks them on top of each other like they were before. I could change this to row, which is the default, so it puts them next to each other. So actually, I don't need to put this at all, because that is what it starts off as. As soon as you say display flex, it automatically defaults to a row direction. All right, so that's good. Now let's center them. Justify content center. There we go, it's in the middle. And now I need to put a little gap between them. So I could put margin, but Flexbox gives me these gaps. So if I say gap of 5 pixels, there we go. There's 5 pixels between the elements. And let's just change the font size a little bit. go with 0.9 rem. Okay, how's that looking? Pretty good. Say it's almost identical. I just need to change the styling on the link. But you can see just by working with Flexbox how easy it is to arrange things. Even though it's not talking about the overall layout, it's just the layout here within this little div. It's just easy and saves a bit of time. So now let's style this bit here. And that link actually had its own class of page. Page for create a page. So let's target that one. And first of all, the color we change to black. So I'm not going to bother defining this as a variable. I only have one section that's got black color. Okay, there we go. And font weight, I'll go bold. Not bolder, just full on bold. There we go. Okay, and that's it. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so actually that is the main wrapper section complete. So if I switch between them, there's not really anything else to add. And like I say, you can play around with the padding and the margin and maybe the widths and heights a little bit, but the actual structure is there. So what's left to do now is the footer. So let's go back to the HTML document and add that in. Now there's a whole bunch of links here. I'm not going to type all of them out. I just want to get the point across of how to do it. So I'm just going to do enough to get the structure working and kind of get this, you notice that they wrap as we get bigger and smaller. So I'm just going to put in a few just to kind of demonstrate. So let's go in here into my HTML document, and remember this section, it essentially covered all that top bit. So I don't want to put any more inside it. I want to go underneath, and just within my body tag, I want to add a footer. And within the footer, I'm going to have all of these, well, I'm going to have a bunch of links. So when I'm displaying links like this, although they're in a line and they don't have anything next to them, it's actually a list. It's an unordered list. So if I create an unordered list tag, within it, I can create link elements. List elements, not link elements. And those link elements, those list elements are going to be links. So let's demonstrate rather than talking too much. I'll just show you what this looks like. I'm going to give them all a class of footer link so that I can add a little bit extra styling to them specifically. And then what is the content? Well, the first one was sign up. I think, yeah, sign up, login, messenger. So I've got them here. Close the tag, close that tag. So if I save it, there you go. It's appeared here and I've got this link. So now I can just copy this down and add another couple below. So the next one is login. And then we had messenger. Okay, there we go. They're stacking on top of each other. Now I'm not going to type all these out manually. I've got little snippets on my other screen. I am just going to copy them across. Save a bit of time. And there we go. So that's all the links that I want to put in. And they're stacking on top of each other here nicely. So with that done, I can begin styling them. That's the HTML, that's the markup for the footer complete, and actually for the whole document. Now let's begin with the footer. So we'll target that. The first thing to do, notice the color is actually different. The color is white, so it changes the background color. So let's go in here, say background color, and we'll go with white. So we should have a variable for it already. Okay, save that. And oh, that's kind of weird. So what's happened here? Well, it's essentially said that the body is the full size of the page. The footer goes underneath. The footer by default, it doesn't go at the bottom of the page. It just goes at the bottom of the content. So if I have available space below, well, that's going to continue being the body. So actually, I want to make sure that this is extended to the entirety of the available space. So we go into the footer and I'm going to give it a height of 100%. That takes up all the space that was given to it. I could have done it a different way as well. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I could use positioning, for example, give it absolute positioning and just put it to the bottom here. But I think this works fine. This is just essentially doing the same thing, just fills out the rest of the page in white. So it says whatever's left once you've created this, just leave that for the footer. And of course, the next thing I need to do is, you see everything's bunched up against here because I've reset my padding globally to 0. Let's put the padding back in. So my footer is going to have 25 pixels top and bottom, 35 pixels left and right. And now you can actually see what was going on there. All of these, they weren't visible to start with, but all of these have little bullets because it's a list. So it's just a list of individual items, and each of those items contains a link. And that's the same thing as what's going on here. It's just they've been styled to look that way. So now that I've done the footer, I can start working on that list. I can target the unordered list and play around, first of all, with the width. So what happens here is as this gets bigger, they wrap, they take up more and more space, but eventually you get to this point here where they stop growing and it's just a fixed height, fixed width. It doesn't get any bigger than that. So for that, I want to define a max width. So let's go back to this and say that my unordered list is going to have a max width of 1000 pixels. Okay, nothing really changes there by itself, but now this won't go bigger than 1000 pixels. Let's also center it. Say margin of auto, and why did that not work? Oh, it did work. Let's inspect this and go down to my unordered list. Yeah, the unordered list is taking up the entirety of the page. So as it gets bigger, you can see now it is centered. So there's this orange stuff on the left and right, that's the margin. So the unordered list itself is centered, but then of course the contents are left aligned. So that's why you didn't really notice any difference there. But now the next thing, and the most obvious thing, is these are stacked up on top of each other. So that's not really what I want with my links. I want them to be in a line. Well, I've already done that when I was working on this, and it was quite straightforward. I just had to change the display to flex. So this activates Flexbox. It just says that this unordered list is the flex container, and everything that's one level down becomes a flex item. So all of these are now flex items. And that just means that it's taken them all, put them side by side next to each other, and filled in the width of the screen. So that's great. It's still not looking too good, but it's working. So let's do a little bit more styling on them. First of all, as this gets smaller, well, they simply wrap on their own individual sections. I want the whole thing to wrap. So what we do is flex wrap, and we say wrap. By default, it's no wrap, meaning that what you see is what's happening. But when I set this to wrap, it takes the available space and then it puts all the rest of them over to the next line. There we go. You can see them just kind of running over to the next line there. So that's fine, but I want to get rid of those bullets. I don't want them to look like a bulleted list. So we say list style is none. Bullets are gone. Change the font size. 0.7, not font. Font size, that becomes 0.75 rem. Go quite a bit smaller. Change the color of them. I'm not going to use a variable here. I'm just going to go with slightly lighter gray and line height of 1.5. Okay, that essentially, so you didn't really see, I should have demonstrated that better. So let's get rid of that, make the page smaller so they're stacked. But notice they're right up against each other, which I don't want. So that's where the line height comes in. It's just line spacing. So it's just how much space is between the lines. I set it to 2.5. They're spaced out even more. Go back to 1.5. That's kind of what I needed. Okay, and that's working okay. The font size is about right. Color is about right. There's of course no room between them. They're still stacked up right next to each other. So we need to make sure we fix that. Now I could do that with a gap. But that has an unintended consequence. So if I make this smaller and I add a gap here, say 15 pixels, well, it works because it pushes them aside, but it also creates a gap between them top and bottom as well. So that's not a problem when there's only one line of them, but as they wrap and they start to stack up underneath each other, it creates a gap between the lines as well. And I don't want that. I've already got my line height controlling them. So I'm not going to set a gap. I'm going to get rid of that. What I'm going to do instead is go into the list items themselves. So target the li element and give them all a right-hand side margin. Margin of 15 pixels does the same thing. It just pushes them over, gives them 15 pixels between each one. So I think that's actually pretty much it. So I did say that I'm not going to put all of the links in. I just put in a few of them. And when I'm hovering over, I'm getting this. I'm not getting, yeah, okay, so there is still a little bit missing. Okay. Yeah, so when I put my mouse over them, they don't, although they are links, strange, they don't turn to a cursor. So I guess I could do that by just going into my A tag here and saying, well, on hover, so not in that one, but in here, I can say cursor is pointer. Save that. Okay, there we go. That's a lot better. So actually, I created this class thinking that I will need to style them, but it doesn't really look like I do. I've managed to capture it within the A tag. Yeah, I don't even need that class. So what we can do is, I'm not going to delete it right now, but anyway, you don't need this class anymore. And I do try to keep things common, so I don't want to have a whole bunch of classes for all sorts of different things. I try and just keep as a few of them as possible to avoid having too much styling going on. So with that done, I think that's pretty much it. The last thing to do is just to add in the responsiveness. So as this page gets bigger, you notice it flicked from being top to bottom to left and right. And in my case, well, that doesn't really happen. The rest of it works, but it always stays top and bottom. So let's just change that one last thing, and that's going to be done with a media query. So right at the bottom of this, I'm going to add an @ and media, and the media query is going to come in based on particular widths. So I say the min width of 890 pixels. So if the width exceeds this value, then I want to change a few things. Well, first of all, I want to change the way my main wrapper is displayed. So let's go into the main wrapper as it is at the moment and add in a couple of things. So I did say that I was going to come back to this, and this is where we need to change the display of it. And the only thing I want to do here is just make it a display of flex. So this is going to convert it to a Flexbox. Now when I save this, straight away you see it's already tried to stack them left and right, but I don't want that to be the case when it's this small screen. So let's change the flex direction to column. And now it goes back to how it was. So it's still exactly as it was previously, but now I know that I've got this available to me. So by simply changing the flex direction in my media query, I can have them left to right. And that's what we're going to be doing. So we'll go back down here and we can add that in. So let's target that class of main wrapper. And first of all, a couple of little things. The width I want to set to 90%. So the width is going to be 90% of the page. And actually, let's make it bigger so that we can see it developing as it goes. Okay, so there you go. Now it's 90% of the page. Kind of looks a bit funny what's going on there. But the other thing is, as this one gets bigger, it gets to a certain size and then it stops. Mine just keeps going to 90%. So I need to give it a max width as well. I'll set this to 980 pixels. Okay, there we go. Now it's limited. What else do we do? Well, of course, we don't want it stacked anymore. So this is the important bit with flex. So flex direction becomes row. There we go. They're left and right. And let's go padding top of 70 pixels. So maybe cheating a little bit, but I'm just bumping it down from the top of the screen. So now before I continue with this bit, I've almost finished styling that. I need to move on to the branding. So I need to change a couple of things here. First of all, notice that the text was originally centered, but now that we've got this layout, it's actually left aligned. So let's just adjust that by saying text align left, and that moves it over. And I also need to move it down the page a little bit. So let's give it padding at the top of 80 pixels. That moves it down, and I want to give it a fixed width. So I'll say width of 400 pixels. There you go. And as soon as that happened, you notice that this panel came shooting over to the left-hand side rather than staying where it was. But on the real page, it stays to the right of its container. So what's happening here, if I inspect the page, and let's go down to the section, is it this div? Oh no, it's the whole section wrapper. So this shows the flex here, and you can see the outlines if I turn that on. We've got this left-hand side, and then we've got this middle bit, and then there's this unused space. So when I set my width to a fixed amount, it said, okay, this is going to be 400, this has a fixed width, and then we just have this empty space left over. Well, what I want to do is move this to the right and keep this on the left. So within my wrapper, because it's a Flexbox display, I can play around with how the content is justified. So I can say justify content. If I set this to center, for example, it takes that available space and it moves them to the middle. So it's kind of like margin auto. But what I could also do is say space between. And now it spaces them out. It takes all the available space, and rather than having it on the right, it just puts them in between the elements. If I had 3 elements, it would do the same. It would evenly distribute them between them. But here, it's just put them in the middle. So that's looking a lot better. It's spaced out properly. It doesn't seem to be filling out the text in the exact same way though. It looks like this, maybe my width is a little bit too small. Let's go with 450. Yeah, okay, that's a bit better. Yeah, so now it spills over. Actually, I think the other thing is maybe the text gets bigger. Yeah, it looks like that's what's happening. It's the font. So it's maybe not the width, but the font. Well, I guess both. But the font definitely gets bigger here. So that's another thing that we want to add to that media query. So the font here was my H2, I believe it was the slogan, and it's 1.5. So let's just bring this down and target that within this media query. So my slogan is also, going to change. It's already 1.5 rem, so let's go with 1.7 rem. How does that look? Yeah, that's about right. I think the width again is just too small though. Let's go with 480. There we go. Okay, that's looking a lot better. And in fact, I would say, I mean, it's not 100% copy, but if you play around with the padding and the margin, maybe the font a little bit, it's pretty much thereabouts. Let's bring that in, just make sure that there we go. So you can see it kind of shrinks up a little bit and then pops up to the top just like it was supposed to. So we've got this responsive design working as well. And that's pretty much it. That's how I copied the Facebook login page. So if you found this useful, then please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.